the Atlantic Herring Section. Thank you all for coming in, Alexandria. We're going to call the Atlantic Herring Section meeting to order. First order of business is the approval of the agenda. Are there any changes, additions, or deletions? David.
I'd like, I guess under other business, or if it fits in someplace else in the agenda, an update regarding the request we made back in May as to the ability of the National Marine Fisheries Service to do sampling of George's Bank, Nantucket Shoal spawning fish. I'd like that on the agenda. If nothing else, then an update as to where we stand with that.
Yeah, thank you, David. That was going to be an issue I was going to raise the section that will be under other business. Are there any other issues? Can everybody hear now? Dennis? Okay. Without objection, the agenda is approved. Looking at to approve the proceedings from May 2014, are there any changes, additions, or seeing none, consider the proceedings approved? Are there any comments from the public on issues that are not on today's agenda? Seeing none, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa for a review of the public comment summary on drafted Amendment 3.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So now I will go over the summary of comments to the public information document for draft Amendment 3. So as a quick review for the 4 issues presented in the PID, they were, first is the spawning area efficacy, so a review of the boundaries and default closure dates. Second issue is fixed gear set-aside provision. This is the rollover for unused set-aside after November 1st. Third issue is gear declaration, a requirement to declare gear before each season starts. And the fourth issue is the empty fish hole provision, a requirement to empty fish holds of fish before departing on a trip. So this is the timeline for the development of the amendment. So the public information document was available for public comment from May through July. So currently the section is to review the comments and consider development of draft Amendment 3. So staff held 3 public hearings in June in the states of Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. The hearings were open question format to allow stakeholders to comment on each issue and management question. A total of 23 individuals, not including staff, participated at these meetings. So the table in the comment summary provides a breakdown of the attendees, which included fishermen, federal and state staff, nonprofit representatives, and section members. So in addition to comments provided at public hearings, we also received 4 letters, all of which are from groups. 3 of these letters are from associations representing the interests of fishing industry and bait providers. 1 letter is from a nonprofit environmental organization. So the first issue is spawning area efficacy. These are the management questions in the draft public information document. So the plan development team had reviewed the boundary and sampling programs for Massachusetts and New Hampshire spawning area, and they found that the current spawning area boundary is adequate and further sub-areas are not warranted at this time. It also recommended extending the spawning closure by at least 2 weeks, so for a total of 6 weeks in this one particular area. And the rationale for this extension is for a gear bias during sampling. And again, you can look in the PID for the explanations for this. So these are comments that we received on the spawning area issue. Participants in Massachusetts and New Hampshire expressed that the regulations are sufficient for protecting spawning herring at this time. Although some representatives did comment that there should be no default closure if there is no spawning fish detected with adequate sampling. The nonprofit organization, through the letter, was strongly opposed to removing default spawning closures. In Maine, participants wanted a divide of the Massachusetts-New Hampshire area because they have anecdotal evidence of fish spawning at different times from the northern and southern portions of this area. They would like to see scientific assessment of mixing in this particular area. Other comments on this issue is that if there are any adjustments to boundaries, it should be supported by science. So participants from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine, which are all three public hearings, the fishing industry members do not support a 6-week closure for Massachusetts, New Hampshire area. And the reason for this is that it would severely limit fishing opportunities. The NGO group, however, supported the 6-week closure in Massachusetts, New Hampshire as a precautionary measure. And the PDT's response to this, they wanted to emphasize that this was a biological reason for extending this closure because the sampling protocol after the initial closure, so to trigger the 2-week additional closure, is based on a 25% fish, 25% of the fish that have yet to spawn, not the gonadic somatic index, which is based on the body index. So this protocol is more susceptible to the gear bias. So additional comments on spawning area. In Massachusetts, the participants expressed that the spawning closure should be effective sooner than the 7 days after the threshold is detected. And the PDT response to this was that the 7 days was built in to consider the administrative process for states to publish closure announcements, and it also takes into consideration the rate at which the female fish ripen. So having a closure 7 days after spawning is detected, the thresholds that are expressed in the FMP will protect the fish during peak spawning activity. So additional comments on spawning area include Commission should advance spawning protection in Georges Bank and Nantucket Shoals, and a suggestion was to submit a request to the Northeast Fisheries Management Council and NOAA Fisheries via the draft Omnibus Habitat Amendment 2. So the second issue is the fixed gear set-aside. So we asked the public whether the unused portion after November 1st should be rolled into the remaining area of 1A subquota. So in the PID, the PDT noted at this time that there is no biological basis for adjusting the fixed gear issue. Again, there were no landings in the past 10 years after November 1st, and in the event that the fixed gear fishery does need to catch fish, they can access the Area 1A subquota. So the comments from Massachusetts and New Hampshire, as well as written comments, agree with the PDT's recommendation of maintaining status quo. Participants from Maine, however, wish to adjust the current provision. So they suggested having a set-aside available in trimester 1 before the rest of the fishery has access to fish. And they also want to be exempt from spawning closures, but they're still prohibited from possession of spawning fish. The third issue is gear declaration, which considers a requirement for vessel owners to declare their intended fishing gear prior to the beginning of the season. The PDT had not recommended moving this issue forward because a system would need to be set up for each state to collect the information, and there's also a compliance issue. There would be a system to enforce compliance. And there would be considerations, there would need to be considerations for fishermen who may wish to fish with different gears and in more than one area. Furthermore, the PDT does not believe that this information would be necessary to make the projections for harvest control measures. So the comments we received on this issue, the fishermen were strongly against a gear declaration requirement because they need the flexibility to change gears in response to market and also in case of equipment failures. The participants in Maine, however, offered additional comments on this issue. They voiced that it was more important to know the capacity of vessels rather than the gear types. So as a suggestion, they recommended a cap on the carrying capacity of carrying vessels. For example, they suggested 200 to 250 metric tons. The last issue is the empty fish hold provision, which is a requirement for vessel owners to empty the hold of fish prior to departure for a trip. So as a reminder, the New England Fishery Management Council had approved this requirement in its draft framework adjustment 4 for fish holds to be empty before leaving a dock. The council also adopted alternative 2.1.2, option 2, option C. A waiver may be issued for instances when there are fish in the holds after inspection by an appropriate law enforcement officer. And this alternative will only apply to Category A and B boats. So the intent is for waivers to be issued for refrigeration failure and non-marketable reported fish. And the PDT they recognized that fishermen might have surplus cash that they cannot dispose of and is a challenge to get rid of. So the proposed requirement to empty holds of fish would be an incentive to curb wasteful fishing practices. So the comments we received on this is that all comments were in support of an empty fish hold provision. Many people had suggested a limit of 2 waivers. So the PDT offered some additional comments on this. They noted that the provision may not be necessary in the interstate FMP if the federal plan implements the measure. And they do not recommend a limit on waivers because they believe that if people had a legitimate reason and it was verified by a law enforcement officer, that there shouldn't be a limit on proper disposal of this fish. So other comments that we received is that the Commission should advance spawning protections in the Georges Bank Nantucket Shoals. Again, submitting a letter to Northeast Fishery Management Council and NOAA Fisheries. And another comment was to keep in mind that the status of the fishery is not overfished and not experiencing overfishing. So just as a brief recap on Issue 1, spawning area efficacy, in general, comments were maintain the area boundaries, maintain the 4-week closure in Massachusetts, New Hampshire area, remove default closure dates, and work with federal agencies on offshore spawning protections. Second issue, fixed gear set aside. Most comments do not support adjusting the measure, except participants in Maine. Third issue, gear declaration. There were no supporting comments other than to focus on capacity. Issue 4, empty fish hold. All comments were in favor of this issue. So thank you, and if there are any questions, I'll take those right now.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa, for your presentation and your recap. Before I go to other section members, question for you is, did the PDT address the issue of default closures if no spawning fish is detected with adequate spawning?
No, at this time they have not addressed that issue.
Other questions on the presentations? Are there any questions? David?
In line with what you just asked, Melissa, Terry, has the plan development team had an opportunity to reflect once again on the initial recommendation that spurred our desire to get the public comment on the 2-week extension of the New Hampshire, Massachusetts spawning closure? Has that been revisited by the plan development team in light of the public comment, or does that recommendation still stand?
Yes, so we had a conversation with PDT members from Maine and New Hampshire and also MITC grant. So on this issue, they still maintain the recommendation to extend the Massachusetts, New Hampshire area to 6 weeks, and that is mainly because of the gear bias for the second round of sampling after the 4-week closure. Again, the protocols are different from the initial. It's not based on GSI, but on a percentage of fish that have yet to spawn.
Other questions from the section? Any questions from the audience? Back to the section. So Melissa's going to put the recap back up on the screen, and I'd like to go out to the section to provide guidance back to the PDT for drafting the management options for the draft amendment. And if we do it section by section, it would probably be easiest. So first section here is spawning area efficacy. What's the section's pleasure? Doug?
So despite public comment, I heard what the PDT and the TC are saying about the potential of having a 2-week extension. I've also had comments from fishermen in my state that have indicated that he has experienced spawning fish after the spawning closure. So I think I'd like to make a motion to include a section on spawning area efficacy that would include an option that would extend the Maine, New Hampshire spawning closure by 2 weeks, at least for public comment.
Would that be in addition to the measures that are on the board?
That are already in the plan, you mean?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, yes, obviously.
Is there a second to Doug's motion? Seconded by David Pierce. Section discussion, and Tony just raised an issue. I mean, if we concur, we can do it without objection, or if there is a difference of opinions, we will bring this to a vote. David?
I just wanted to point out the interesting situation we create for ourselves when we go out with a PID with issues like this, because we're going to go out with the amendment, assuming we decide to have that amendment with these elements, and we're going to get the same comments from the public that we got during the review of these concepts in the plan, in the PID. So I think we pretty much understand and know beforehand what the public is going to say. So it's almost like a redo. It's okay. This is the way we do business. This is a difficult one, and I would be inclined not to support it if it was not for the fact that the plan development team and those involved in the hard work of determining the GSI, of determining whether or not these fish are spawning. If they had said they oppose this, but they're on board, they have said that this is needed. I certainly understand the industry's objections to this. Certainly the midwater trawlers that have commented with a 2-week extension, it could prevent them from actually going into the area and fishing at all. So that's obviously a concern. Nevertheless, it is a spawning closure. We've had this spawning closure in place for a long time. It's integral to the way in which we manage sea herring in the Gulf of Maine. As a consequence of that, in light of the plan development team's perspective and continued insistence that this is merited, I'd like to put it in the amendment and indeed bring it out to public hearing for further comments. So I would support the motion.
Other comments to the motion on the board? Are there any comments from the audience? Okay. Emerson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just wondering if this or how this is consistent with the federal plan. I'm unfamiliar with the federal plan, so I'm wondering what the consistency is.
There isn't any. Spawning areas are ASMFC management measure. They're not included in the federal plan. Bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in other words, in the amendment, draft amendment, there'll be the options still in, or is it just going to be, this is it, 6 week or extend, or is it going to be comments on both?
I'm going to defer to Melissa for how she's going to construct the document.
So we will always have an option for status quo, and then an additional option, the new one, would be to extend it.
Are there any other comments? Seeing none, the motion is to include a section on spawning area efficacy, extending the spawn closure in Maine through New Hampshire by 2 weeks. Motion made by Doug Grout and seconded by Dr. Pierce. Is there an objection to the motion on the board? Seeing none, the motion carries. David?
I would make a request that when the amendment is put together, there needs to be more discussion, description of the likely impacts of this particular spawning closure extension on the fishery itself relative to the quotas we have by period and, what the likely consequences will be to the fixed gear fish, to the mobile gear fishery, the purse seine fishery, the midwater trawl fishery. Will this particular extension result in an end of the midwater trawl fishery in that particular area? In other words, the quota will not be accessed, the first part of the quota will not be accessed by the midwater trawlers. So there needs to be a good description, a far better description of the impacts of this particular closure on the participants in the fisheries, especially those who wait for an opportunity to get access to the Massachusetts-New Hampshire spawning closure when it opens up. The document did its best, the PID did its best to introduce the concern and likely consequences, but this is a big deal. This is a very big deal for the sea herring fishery out of the Gloucester area in particular. So we owe it to those individuals, to the industry, to the fishermen in the process, just to be as detailed as we can possibly be with our estimation of the likely impacts.
Kirby, could you put the recap back up on the board, please? Okay, before we move on, is there any further guidance from the section on number 1, the spawning area efficacy component? Okay. Seeing none, we're on to fixed gear set-aside provision. Most comments do not support adjusting except for the participants in Maine. I'm a little bit in a tough position right here, so are there any comments on this section number 2? David.
I'd appreciate a recap. Most comments do not support adjusting except participants in the state of Maine. If Melissa would, I'd appreciate you going back over the reasons why the participants in Maine do not support the adjustment, or do support the adjustment.
So some participants in Maine expressed that they had anecdotal evidence of fish that are occurring after November 1st, and they just wanted more access to the fish, from what I've heard.
And I'm going to step out of my chair seat and turn it over to Richie.
Go ahead, Terry.
And I'm going to follow up to your question, David. Yes, the PDT very clearly pointed out historically the fish migrated out of the Gulf of Maine by November. But as we all know, there's been changing environmental conditions lately. For the last several years, we've heard from the state of DMR has heard from several or more than several fixed gear fishermen that they're adult fish on the shore in November that they do not have access to after the quota has been taken. So it would be our state's interest in having access for these few small boats at a time of the year when it's just a handful of fish that might help these folks out. The comments that came from the main public hearing addressed a couple of other issues, and perhaps if this section moves forward with consideration of the fixed gear provision, those could be taken out for public comment as well.
Chair, back to you, Terry.
Thank you, sir. Jeff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question. If a change is made to the commission plan, would we have to go back and make an adjustment to the federal plan, or could we do that in the specs in the federal plan? And then the issue was raised by someone as to whether or not we could architect, or you could architect, a fixed gear quota rollover or not. And my second question is, can the commission create that by itself in the Gulf of Maine under this plan, or if we were interested, or if you were interested in making a change like that, will we have to take that issue also back to the federal plan and make a change? I think, so those are my questions and how this might operate. Thank you.
Commissioner Adler has been advocating for years to preempt the council process, and this action would do that. I would point out that the chair of the hearing committee sits on this section as well, and there will more than likely be at least one action prioritized by the council for hearing in 2015. I don't know the answers to some of your questions, but if it does become an issue where we have to do complementary rulemaking, that possibility could well be in the works.
All right, thanks. I'm on that committee too, and I haven't read Doug's list yet. I just got it the other day, so we will do that. Thanks.
I would note he had another section under it. Craig.
Thank you, Terry. So when you were describing your understanding of why the difference of the opinion existed, it was because there is quota still left that they would like to be able to use, or it was after the quota had already been met, they'd still like to fish?
The latter. The Area 1A quota would have been totally caught, and they would then not have access to a quota until the next fishing year.
And so the extension of the time period then would allow them to fish on what quota? Or am I missing something?
A set-aside.
Okay, thank you.
Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, if I understand this right, I mean, if they don't catch it, it goes back into the Area 1A total allowable catch anyway. So if we extend it 2 weeks or a month and they don't catch it, it goes back into the Area 1A set-aside or allowable. And if it doesn't get caught, then it supposedly would enhance the biomass of the entire species and be part of the total allowable catch the next year. I don't see the downside to allowing them to have a little more time.
Other comments? David.
Yeah, just a clarification, Terry. You said in your comments that they were requesting that the fixed gear quota that not roll over, that we extend that particular opportunity for them so that they can continue to catch adult herring. We're not talking about juvenile fish. We're talking about adult herring.
Correct.
That's always been mine. And by adult, we're talking age 3 and older. It's my hangover from 1970s and 1980s.
Those were the comments that we received, David. I think should this be approved to go out for public comment, we certainly could elicit that response from the public if in the process. Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I see no reason not to extend it, but I was just saying, okay, if Area 1A closes and there's still a set-aside, and then the set-aside doesn't get taken by, I don't know when, late in the fall, do you reopen Area 1A? Is that how it works?
It's a very small amount of fish, and should this measure move forward, it would be up to this section to determine whether or not it was rolled over into the following year or set into a conservation measure. Dennis?
I think the number is, what, 500 tons? Is that?
It's 500 metric tons. For 2013 and 2015, it was specified at 295 metric tons.
Yeah, 295. If we close after we've reached the quota and we add the 295 or whatever's remaining, brings us back under that trigger point, wouldn't it not behoove us, but require us to open up 1A again to complete the quota?
I'm in a tough spot sitting here to debate you, so I'm going to turn to Doug.
So, because this is part of the sub-ACL, and there already is a rollover provision, of the sub-ACL. If they don't catch it, it gets rolled over a year plus, not in the immediate following year, but 1 year after. So as long as the overall quota does not go over by 295 metric tons, let's just assume we closed right at the appropriate quota minus the 295, then that would be rolled over under the current provisions of the federal plan, and I believe of our plan too.
Jeff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, like Dr. Pierce suggested for the earlier discussion, an analysis of what impact this would have on the fleets, I think would be important because of the fact that the Midwater Trawl fleet doesn't get up there until after October 1st, and now it could be even much later if the western enclosure closes. We have to wait for that. Those folks have to wait for that. So, it'd be interesting to see how many times this 295 was actually turned back to the fishery, because if it's turned back late in the fishery, the Midwater Trawl fleet would get most of that fish the way that that's shared. So I think an analysis of the impact of this, and again, how often it's been used, how often it's come back to the industry would be helpful, because I don't think any of us really know. I don't even know that it's ever been released back to the quota, frankly. I don't remember that it has been.
David?
Yeah, I was at a council committee meeting on ecosystem-based fisheries management last week, and there was a great deal of discussion about changes in the environment within the Gulf of Maine, rather stark changes, surprising changes that the scientists of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center continue to say are occurring and having some effect on the important fisheries resources within the Gulf of Maine. We're learning more and more about that all the time. I'm going to assume that indeed what is described in the PID is happening in light of the changes within the Gulf of Maine, temperature-wise and otherwise, and that the fish are not moving away from the shore the way they have been in the past. That's why we have that specific time period for that set aside. The assumption is the fish move away from shore. They're no longer available to fixed gear, therefore let's do what we did. I'm going to assume that they are staying close to shore longer, and therefore they are still there to be caught by fixed gear fishermen. Consequently, it makes sense for us to include in this amendment, with the analysis that Jeff has suggested, that which we brought to those public hearings. And that is, and I can make it as a motion, I suppose, move that the amendment include the provision that the unused fixed gear set aside would not be rolled into the Area 1A subquota on November 1. That would be the motion, and the objective would be as stated in the statement of the problem within the PID, and that is to maintain access to a dedicated quota for the fixed gear fishery, and that maintained access would be necessary because of the fish changing behavior. They're staying close to shore more so now apparently than they have in the past. So that's my motion, Mr. Chairman.
So we don't need a motion unless we're going to remove it. But the guidance that you and many of the other section members have provided will be has been noted by Melissa and then be incorporated into the document. Are there any further comments on this section number 2? So, Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do we need a motion to eliminate the November 1st time or not?
I'm going to defer to Melissa, but my sense is that if this provision stays in the document, that what you've read in the draft amendment will be perfected by the comments and guidance that have just been provided by the section, which we'll then review to approve for public comment at our fall meeting. Okay. Yeah. All right. We're on to Number 3, the deer declaration, pretty clear comments from the industry. What's the section think? Doug?
Yeah, I would suggest that we remove this section.
Is that in form of a motion?
So moved.
Seconded by Steve. Comments on the motion to remove gear declaration from the draft amendment? Any comments from the audience? Back to the section. I'll read it into the record, Joe, as soon as I see it. Move to remove the section on deer declaration in the draft amendment. Motion made by Mr. Grout and seconded by Mr. Train. Is there an objection to the motion on the board? Seeing none, the motion carries. We're on to item number 4, which is the empty fish hold. Comments from the section. Doug?
Well, the council moved forward on this because the ASMFC had indicated an interest in this, and since they have moved forward and have approved a document with this included, I think it's appropriate that this commission continue to move forward with this provision in the document.
Other comments? Any comments from the audience? Ray?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commission members. I have one concern here. Oh, I'm sorry, Raymond Kane, commercial fisherman. As far as this commission is concerned and the council, I have a concern on this empty fish hole provision. They're talking on a council level about giving them permission if they have failures, so I would like to see a number put on the failures, like the RSWs or refrigerated seawater failures, like how many times can a vessel have an RSW failure, and how many times will they be able to dump because of this failure. It was never addressed on a council level, and I would like both the council and this commission to address that, like what's a fair number, like look at their history, how many RSW failures do they have annually, come up with a legitimate number, and move forward, as opposed to just giving them open declaration to report RSW every time they want to dump fish. Thank you.
Any other comments from the audience? Back to the section. Bill?
All right, in line with what Mr. Kane had said there, in the document, is it going to be, are there going to be options for, unlimited, 2, 4, are there going to be options like that that we can therefore pick after that?
Melissa?
Yes, we should discuss the number of waivers, maybe provide some options right now. So comments have been a recommendation of 2 waivers or no limit.
Doug?
I think it would be worthwhile at least exploring that as a possibility, and as far as numbers, it might be more appropriate for the PDT to contact companies like Jeff's, the company that Jeff represents, to see how often they have raw seawater failures or that result in unmarketable fish, which was the exemption that the council allowed, and to get an idea around how many times those might occur, and then you could come up with some options that would be what's the maximum number? I'm sure, Terry, you might be able to put them in touch with O'Hara Company just to get an idea of what we're talking about for typical refrigeration failures here in a year. And then maybe you could draft some options around that number somehow.
Bill? Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's what I was getting at, is I don't want to put something in that is too loose, and then all of a sudden we decide, or let's say if we just had unlimited, and then we decide on 2. Well, I don't know that you can get more restrictive in the end. You can always relax, usually the way public things go. So that's why I was suggesting that you put a range in there, although if you go from 2 to unlimited, I think you got it covered, because you can always stay unlimited, or you can go 6, 8, 9, 2, whatever. So as long as we leave the door open there that we can make a decision, that's what I was getting at. Thank you.
Well, we will have another bite at this apple in the fall, once it's a final document ready for public comment. Other section comments on issue number 4? Seeing none, I see no objections from retaining this issue in the document. The last is, are there any other issues that the section would like to have included in the draft addendum? We did hear in the public comments one suggestion of a carrying cap. Okay, I see no other issues from the section. Are there any issues from the public? Patrick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Patrick Paquette, recreational advocate from the state of Massachusetts, and also partial owner of a company called Godstriper Baits. We own 2 charter boats that fish off of the backside of Cape Cod. I understand it's not necessarily in this particular document yet, but you're closing at 92%. Area 1B failed. You went significantly over the backside, and our fish can't come to shore because we have no forage along our shore, and we right now can't catch fish because 2 weeks before the fish normally move into our waters, we got wiped out by whatever it was, 38% overage of Area 1B. And this is a problem, and it's a problem that's not going away, and we've heard lots of language but no action, and you've got a document getting ready to move, and I believe that this could be corrected by addendum. The closing at 92% failed. I don't know why that we don't have this issue being addressed now, because on the backside of the Cape, recreational anglers and commercial anglers are paying for a lack of sea herring. And so it's going to stay in your mind, because we're not going to keep quiet, because it killed our season. Killed it. Matter of fact, you're going to hear during the striped bass that those who believe that we have a body of fish at sea that aren't coming ashore, you're going to hear about what's happening to the Massachusetts commercial quota, because our aggregation of fish is still there. It just happens to be well offshore, and you will know that when you hear about our enforcement numbers, about over 50 boats being fined as being in the EEZ because our bait got wiped out and the fish won't come to shore, and it's because of this fishery, and this issue needs to be addressed at what happened in Area 1B. Thank you.
Are there any other comments from the audience? Back to the section. Jeff?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just got a text from one of the advisors who has excellent participation, concerned about the 6-week closure in the western area, and asked if that area could be split to minimize the impact of a 6-week closure. And I'm not sure. I'm trying to figure out what the person is asking about. I don't know if that's to have have there be 2 areas down there, or look at when the spawning has taken place to somehow limit a 6-week closure, some kind of a split in this document. And I don't know beyond what I've just said, what the person's really getting at. But I don't know if it's a geographical split to make two areas down there or what, but clearly that's a big hit, the 6 weeks. So I just wanted to register that we're already getting comments in opposition, again, to the extension of that area, and someone made the suggestion it be split. So if we could at least take that under advisement and figure out what the person's talking about when we draft the document between now and the fall, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
I will note that that was a recommendation that had been made in the past, and the PDT has commented against it. Melissa, can you provide some more details, please?
Yes, so we did receive comments on a suggestion to split the Massachusetts-New Hampshire area. So again, the PDT wants to stress that they don't have the information right now to inform the correct boundary split at this time. Also, I did ask the question whether there is like a mixing of the fish in the area, or whether this would apply to like a northern and southern region. And the PDT believes that the 6-week closure should apply to the entire area because it would benefit the spawning behavior throughout the region.
Jeff.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The individual also wanted me to remind the section that the 2012 benchmark assessment estimated spawning stock biomass at 517,000 metric tons, which is above BMSY of 157,000 metric tons. So they wanted, I think, to make sure that the state of the spawning stock biomass be considered when an extension of a spawning closure was considered. Again, expressing their objection. Thanks.
Are there any other comments? Dennis.
To Mr. Paquette's comments about what happened in Area 1B, triggering it at 92% with about a 3,000-ton quota puts you within 240 tons of the quota. Do we need a lower number there? Or at least can we have a review of what happened in 1B? I can't recall exactly, but wasn't it attributed to a particular operation or whatever? Was it beyond our control? Did they go over the number so quick, so fast, that 92% number really wasn't significant in halting the fishery at the right time?
Small amount of fish. Doug?
Yeah, that was my comment, that the Area 1B quota right now is extremely small compared to the total ACL of the fish. And given that we're dealing with boats that are high-volume fishery boats, it's very difficult for National Marine Fisheries Service to predict on a weekly basis when the quota will be, 92% of the quota will be taken. And as a result, the Council probably in next year's plan of action will be considering management action that may change the makeup of the 1B. It may be rolled into one of the other areas or some other kind of option that would try and address this constant difficulty with trying to manage a very small quota compared to the other three areas.
Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Another way the section could influence this would be, as we do in 1A, a days out scenario. Only so many landing days a week. Don't open it up full bore a couple days a week or something, and that would slow down the harvest and give the service better ability to shut it down at an appropriate time.
Jeff.
Thank you. I think one of the other difficulties is it's very hard to guess where the fish are going to be, too. And I think if you go back, and we should look at the percentage of catches in 1B and the other areas over time. I mean, the industry has not always been over in 1B. This year, there was no fish in Area 2. I think, would we take 30% of the Area 2 quota or something like that? So there's got to be plenty of forage out there, because I think we're only taking about a third of the quota. So it's hard to predict that the fish are going to be in 1B. I think that's just where they happen to be, and that quota is very small. Remember, it was kept small because of Massachusetts concerns for the backside of the Cape, and it's a big area. 1B is huge. I think it's bigger than 1A. So, but it's hard to predict that they're there. So I'm not sure how a days out scenario would work there, because you can't always predict, how many fish are there and what year they're going to be there, I guess, Mr. White. So that's just another thought I had. Thank you.
Any other thoughts for inclusion in this draft amendment? Seeing none, we are going to need a motion to move the draft motion, the draft amendment as amended forward to the PDT for development. Made by Bill Adler, is there seconded by Steve Train. Is there a need for discussion? Are there any further comments? Are there any objections? We need to have it on the board so I can read it. No? Joe's happy, so the motion carries. Melissa, we're on to agenda item number 6, the AP.
Okay, so we sent a memo to section members with a list of the current advisory panel membership, which includes notes of attendance. For example, if an attendant has excellent participation or poor. So we would like for each section to review their membership, reach out to people that may not be very active, and see if they're interested in continuing to support this advisory panel. As we move forward, we would like to have more active participation so we can have the right amount of comments as we develop options for this document and moving forward as well. So please take a look at the list and get back to me as soon as possible.
Richie.
Melissa, can you tell me when the AP phone calls usually take place? Are they during the day or in the evening?
Usually during the day, but I do put out a doodle poll to sense people's availability, and I'm trying to be as flexible as possible.
Okay, because I know one of our participants has not been active, but he has a lot of interest, and he fishes every day, short of a hurricane. So his availability probably is extremely limited during the day. So I didn't know, was there ever discussion of an evening phone call?
Not during my requests, but I do make a point that if they cannot attend a conference call, they can always email me or call me at their convenience, and I always try to call them back.
So, state directors, if you could work with your fellow commissioners and see if we can populate or repopulate this AP. We're going to need the AP as we move forward with the draft amendment in the fall. Do you need any more than that, Melissa? No. Okay, we're on to other business. Tony.
So this is in regard to the letter that we sent to both the New England Fishery Management Council as well as the Northeast Fisheries Science Center on whether or not there would be any opportunity for additional or for sampling to look at the Nantucket Shoal spawning area. And we are still working with the Science Center on trying to see if they would have sampling opportunities within their current sampling protocol to help us with this study, and we will continue to discuss at the fall NRCC meeting and report back to the section at the October meeting. I will say that in the discussions that we've had so far, it would most likely need to be sampling that that's currently occurring within the Science Center, because right now they also have very tight budgets, and so there isn't any additional funding available for any new sampling, unless potentially we made a priority change through the council provisions, which then would set changes in the priorities for the Science Center, which I think is how that occurs.
There's also a logistical issue with the sampling of getting fresh fish ashore when they're coming from offshore, even if it's an RSW. David?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I'm still trying to understand the sequence of events and what still needs to be done. My understanding is that the NRCC did task the Northeast Fisheries Science Center to go over the proposal and then to suggest additional sampling that could be done with the existing sampling program. So the tasking has occurred, the center just has not yet responded, correct?
The tasking has occurred. There was a misunderstanding of what the tasking was, so they are going back and redoing the task.
Okay, so just some miscommunication, that's been corrected, and now we await for a response.
Correct.
Thank you.
And the request was on behalf of both the council and the commission. Still the same miscommunication. David?
Yeah, I thought this is under other business. I thought I would inform the section that in light of what happened this past year with concern about fishing for sea herring off of the backside of the Cape, fishing right on the state line, perhaps even fishing illegally inside of state waters, that still has been alleged, definitely not proven. I'm continuing to address what I may bring forward to the New England Fishery Management Council, to the Herring Committee, and that is a revisiting of what was offered up quite a few years ago regarding restrictions on fishing on the backside of the Cape Cod, not just near state waters, but farther from state waters, going quite a ways off. Those of us who have been around for a while may recall all the discussions we had about concern about local depletion, about the fixed gear per seine gear only area, the exclusion of other mobile gear. There was a proposal at that time when we first considered this concept for an extension of that closure to near-water trawling off of the backside of the Cape. Coordinates that I can't recall at the moment, but I'm looking into that again in light of the very legitimate concerns expressed by many individuals, recreational fishermen, commercial fishermen, regarding the intensive effort of mid-water trawling on the backside of the Cape right on state waters, concern about catch of a haddock and other things. So just advance notice that this is something I'm pursuing, and eventually this concept, this idea may be brought forward to the section.
Is there any other business to come before the section today? Seeing none, thank you all. This meeting is adjourned.